To get 2018 off to a strong start for Armenia and Artsakh here in Washington, D.C., we need your help. The best way you can do that right now is to visit anca.org/2018 and send a single letter to every member of your congressional delegation, your 2 U.S. senators, your 1 U.S. representative. You can do that on your phone right here at anca.org/2018. It takes about 2 minutes. You can go on the record on all the issues that we address as an organization, as a community: justice for the Armenian Genocide, free, safe, and secure Artsakh, stronger U.S.-Armenia relations, and of course the welfare of our communities across the Middle East. You can do that with that one single message at anca.org/2018. Just takes about 2 minutes and you'll be on the record. If that's all you need to hear from me today, that's great. Please go and do that right now. Do it on your phone, do it on your PC, your laptop. Share that message, spread that URL with friends and family, and you can be on record right away and make sure your members of Congress know what you expect of them and that you look forward to hearing of the actions they take on each of these issues. If you'd like a little bit of a deeper dive, a more thorough explanation of each of these policy priorities, I'm looking forward to doing that with you today, to walking through each of those issues. So if you have the time and you have the interest in sort of the texture and granularity behind each of these issues, please pull up a chair, get something to drink, and we'll get started in just a couple of seconds. I'm going to pull up here. On just right to the side of me here. This side of me here is the text that you can follow along with on screen, and we'll walk through each of these issues. I'm going to get started now, and we'll start with Artsakh, because I think there's really nothing more pressing or urgent than the safety and security of Artsakh. Of course, the longer-term status and independence of our second Armenian Republic. So let's start with Artsakh peace. Now, much of the discussion you hear from Washington about Artsakh is around issues of self-determination and territorial integrity, land for peace, and these various kinds of more theoretical discussions. And certainly they have their place, but ultimately the urgent necessity, the absolute burning need for Artsakh is peace on the ground. We need to strengthen the 1994 ceasefire. That is the sine qua non, the absolute precondition for any progress toward all the things we'd like to see for Artsakh and the region. There needs to be peace on the ground. That is the key to a durable and democratic resolution of this conflict. We have on the table a very constructive set of proposals. They were authored by Chairman Ed Royce and Ranking Member Royce-Engel of the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee. Basically, they are a series of 3 proposals, which I'll review in just a second. They're common sense, life-saving measures. They are endorsed by, obviously, the senior leadership of Congress, the U.S. State Department, the OSCE, which is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. That's the group that, through something called the Minsk Group, administers the peace talks around Artsakh. And of course, Armenia and Artsakh have supported these initiatives as well. It turns out the only entity that is obstructing their implementation is the Azerbaijani government. Now, what exactly are these proposals? Well, they're really very, very simple measures. They should be no-brainers. Unfortunately, Baku doesn't see it that way, but I'll walk you through what they are. These proposals call for an agreement from all the parties, and that's Artsakh, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, not to deploy snipers, and many of the deaths that we see on both sides are due to snipers, not to deploy heavy arms, or even to introduce any new weaponry to the line of contact. So it's a very material, concrete effort to de-escalate violence, to avoid incidents that can spark a wider conflagration. And that's obviously something that we think is very, very productive and unfortunately backed only by the Armenian international community, but not also by Azerbaijan. The second element of the Royce-Engel proposals is, I think, perhaps the most important element, which is the deployment of gunfire-locator systems. This is called so often called sounding equipment. This technology, which can be placed along the line of contact, would allow a neutral arbiter, a mediator, perhaps OSCE Minsk group itself to monitor gunfire, the launch of rockets, artillery, the use of small arms. They could monitor that activity such that they could tell where the fire originated, where it was directed, and very often the type of munition used in the attack. This is very, very important because after every attack, which all the evidence points to Azerbaijan, Azerbaijan denies their culpability. This technology would really require accountability and would allow the international community to see who exactly is initiating the aggression. Now, it's not a coincidence that Armenia and Artsakh are perfectly happy to have this accountability. They would like this equipment to be deployed tomorrow. It would be a wonderful thing. And if both sides agree, if Azerbaijan were to lift its objections, then the international community, through the Minsk group or other entities, could send engineers into the line of contact and deploy these gunfire locators. And very soon, after which the next shot fired could be monitored by the international community and the guilty party held accountable. So that's, I think, in many ways, the meat and potatoes of the Royce-Engel proposals. But there's a third element as well, which is, I think, very constructive. Right now, there's something less than 10 OSCE monitors charged with monitoring the entire front line, the entire line of contact. We'd like to see that number grow to 20, 30, 40 monitors so that there's more feet on the ground, more eyes and ears in the region so they can see exactly who is breaking the ceasefire. It's our conclusion, I think, one based on Azerbaijan's own words and its own intentions and the fact that they are the group challenging the status quo. It's our understanding that it's Azerbaijan launching these attacks. We'd like the evidence that the international community can use to prove that, and then in turn follow that up with policy prescriptions that would hold Azerbaijan accountable for the aggression that it continues to visit along the line of contact. Every time we hear of a death, and that's a death on either side of the line of contact, we mourn and we are saddened and heartbroken about the families that suffer so terribly and the young men who are lost in these attacks. Each of these victims on both sides, on either side, are victims of Aliyev's overarching arrogance and ambition to subject a free people to foreign rule. He needs to stop this, and in order for him to stop this, I think it's not going to be based on his goodwill, but rather on the international community demanding accountability and holding him responsible for the deaths that he's causing on both sides of the line of contact. So that's the Royce-Engel proposals. We think the administration has in the past pressed these proposals very often. We read in the Minsk group statements that strengthening the ceasefire is a very high priority. That's, in a sense, a continuation, I think, of a process that began in the U.S. Congress, led by Chairman Royce and Ranking Democrat Engel. We'd like to see the administration raise the stakes on this issue, to increase the pressure on Azerbaijan by appropriating at least $20 million to implement these gunfire locator systems. It's a very inexpensive system, but one that can save many, many lives. And by appropriating money, and basically it raises the stakes, as I said, and it focuses the attention of the international community on who exactly is standing in the way of this proposal, because the will exists in the international community, the U.S., the Minsk group, that's Russia and France as well. The Armenian side is fully invested in this progress, and the American Congress is willing to put up the money to fund the program. Why is it not happening? And I think the inevitable conclusion people will reach is that it's not happening because Ilham Aliyev knows he's guilty and wants to avoid accountability for his actions. So very high priority for us is the U.S. offer of funding for the Royce-Engel proposals, especially the gunfire locators. Let's move on. Parallel to the Royce-Engel proposals, we need to end U.S. military aid to the government of Ilham Aliyev. He neither deserves U.S. military assistance, which only strengthens his military, which he has vowed to use against Armenia and Artsakh. Aliyev has made claims not simply to Artsakh, but to Zangezur, the southern regions of Armenia. And last year he asserted that Yerevan itself is a Azerbaijani Khahanate, a Azerbaijani province. So we need to understand that he does not deserve this aid, and frankly, nor does he need this aid. This is the head of the very wealthy leader of a wealthy oil-producing nation, which has billions of dollars in reserves, that does not need the American taxpayer to pay for arms or weaponry or other defense articles. So we need to see an immediate suspension of U.S. military to Azerbaijan and a strengthening of Section 907. Section 907, for those of you who don't know, was adopted in the early 1990s. It is a provision of U.S. law that remains on the books, restricting U.S. aid to Azerbaijan until they lift their blockades and end their aggression against both Armenia and Artsakh. After 9/11, the Congress carved out waiver authority for the president, and both President Obama and President Trump have exercised that waiver. We think the time has come to revisit that, both in terms of Congress narrowing the waiver language and ultimately the president not choosing to exercise this waiver language. Azerbaijan has shown that it has violated both the spirit and letter of this law, including the waiver authority, and we think that that exemption and that waiver needs to be both narrowed and hopefully withdrawn by the administration. We also have on the Artsakh front, separate from our efforts and very considerable efforts to check Azerbaijani aggression, an effort to build up Artsakh and to strengthen the partnership between Artsakh and the U.S. government. Now, the fact of the matter is that the ability of Americans and citizens in Artsakh to develop that relationship have been limited by a series of outdated and obsolete restrictions. For example, officials of the U.S. government can visit Artsakh under only very narrow conditions. Right now, the OSCE Minsk Group co-chair can visit. That's Andrew Schofer. He and his staff can travel to Artsakh to conduct the peace talks. Obviously, that makes perfect sense. But other members of the State Department, in fact, other diplomats, USAID officials, and other members of the administration, for example, those dealing with healthcare, right? There may be health issues that there can be cooperation on, or education, or cultural. There's a whole range of areas where there should be dialogue, but they have been restricted by these outdated, obsolete restrictions imposed on America, essentially under pressure from Azerbaijan, which has said, we don't think Americans should talk to Artsakh. We disagree with that entirely. We believe that that peace, the peace that we want, the peace that Azerbaijan says that it wants, can be reached through dialogue. The idea of isolating people, the idea of holding them down, alienating them, trying to somehow crush them, that's simply not going to work. Azerbaijan should have learned that by now. We understand, though, that Azerbaijan is on the side of let's not talk, let's not engage, let's not travel, let's not visit, let's isolate. We disagree. The path forward is dialogue, it's discussion. And if members of Congress, for example, as Congressman Valadeo, Congresswoman Gabbard, Congressman Pallone did this past year, if they want to visit Artsakh, they come back only better informed and better able to share with their colleagues and the administration their thoughts about the situation on the ground. Should members of Congress visit Baku as well? Should they visit, should administration officials have a robust dialogue with the Aliyev regime? Of course, that dialogue should take place. There's no benefit to not talking. We now talk to the Cuban government. There's a dialogue even with the North Korean government. Why is it that the citizens of Artsakh are not part of a robust dialogue with the U.S. government? It's only because Azerbaijan's trying to exercise a veto over what American government officials, even American civil society stakeholders, who we can talk to. So I think there's a very clear distinction here, a very clear divide. On the one hand, you have the Armenian side saying, let's talk, let's work it through. These are difficult issues, but we're only going to benefit by a greater level of dialogue. And then you have Azerbaijan, which is saying, no talking. We're going to resolve this through brute force, through violence and aggression. Very clear distinction. I think just as there is on Royce-Engel a clear division that the Armenian side is pro-accountability, so too on the communication side is the Armenian side taking the let's talk, let's work it through. We're pro-dialogue. Ilham Aliyev is not. So that's a profound distinction I think that we need to really stress in this coming year. And your support through this letter and others will mean a lot in that direction. There are also questions of assistance, and we owe a great debt to Congressman Valadeo and his colleagues, among them Jackie Spear, Chairman Royce, Adam Schiff, and others who worked on the Valadeo Amendment, this previous session of Congress, to fund continued demining by the Halo Trust in Artsakh. They're very close to finishing that project, and we need to see that effort through so that farmers and villagers and others do not suffer these terrible accidents from Azerbaijani mines and unexploded ordnance that kill and maim and disable so many. So we want to see that aid continue. We're very encouraged by Congressman Valdeo's amendment to the appropriations bill. We like to see the Congress administration continue Halo Trust funding for whatever time it takes to get that work done. But also, there's a second very important priority, which is rehabilitation services. Now, if any of you have been to Nagorno-Karabakh, if you visited Stepanakert, you know that one of the highlights of that trip is the work done by Baroness Caroline Cox, a member of the British House of Lords, who helped establish the Lady Cox Rehabilitation Center. She is an angel of mercy, and the people who work with her are truly God sent, and they help rehabilitate infants, children, adults, the elderly with cognitive and physical disabilities, kids born with handicaps, adults who have been injured, including through landmines, the elderly, including those who have suffered strokes. Every manner of people needing help is welcomed at the Lady Cox Rehabilitation Center, but they don't have the resources to meet all the needs, either in Karabakh or from the region, because there are people all over the region, from Georgia, from Russia, from elsewhere, who come to the center because they know the care they will receive there is so wonderful. What they do need are funds. What they do need are additional resources, the capacity to provide the great care that they provide to a greater number of people. So we like to see the U.S. aid program to Artsakh continue and complete the Halo Trust demining, but also expand to include the rehabilitation work, including that done by the Lady Cox Rehabilitation Center. Moving on, this is an important year for Artsakh. It was 30 years ago this year that the liberation movement for Artsakh started. As Americans, that means an awful lot to us because it was that very movement that helped spark the democracy and liberation movement that eventually led to the end of the Soviet Union, the threat that Warsaw Pact represented to the free world, the Western world. The citizens of Artsakh were in a sense giant killers and did a great service, obviously for their own citizens, but also for the world, I think. And that movement was a very, very proud moment, not just for Armenians, but I think for all free people around the world. So that liberation movement, obviously we're marking that, the beginning of that, the 30-year anniversary this year. But also, on a more tragic note, the massacres that resulted against Armenians, they started, of course, in Sumgait and Girobad and elsewhere, ultimately in Baku. The response of Azerbaijan to this democracy movement was not to welcome it or to join with it or to say that let's work together to realize our common aspirations for a democratic future, but instead violence, massacres, pogroms. So we will this year be marking that anniversary as well. The ANCA Eastern Region Banquet, which took place last month, was dedicated to the memory of those lost in those massacres and matched with a commitment to making sure that that type of violence is not visited upon the people of Artsakh or Armenia. So it's an important year for us on Artsakh. Let's turn now our attention from Artsakh to the question of the genocide. And the fact of the matter is that after all these years, the U.S. government remains complicit in Ankara's denial of this crime, not simply denial of the truth, but obstruction of justice for this crime, because ultimately that's the North Star here, is a just resolution of the Armenian genocide, one that restores to the Armenian nation, to the extent possible, what was denied to it during this crime, makes the Armenian nation whole, and also makes Armenia safer moving forward from continued aggression from Turkey, also making the world a safer place. It's Turkey's, the precedent set by Turkey's denial of the Armenian genocide makes the world a more dangerous place because it sets the expectation among dictators that they can commit similar crimes and escape justice, that they can do so with impunity. And we've seen this play out again and again over the past century. So for the sake of a safer world, for the sake of justice for the Armenian genocide, for the sake of Armenia's security, ask yourself, can Armenia be safe, neighbored by an unrepentant, overarmed perpetrator of genocide? Of course not. So for many reasons, we need to see America stop outsourcing our genocide policy, our policy on the Armenian genocide, to a foreign government, to the regime of Recep Erdogan. Ask yourself another question, right? We saw in the very recent past horrific atrocities committed by ISIS across the Middle East against religious minorities, including many, many Christians. They used many of the same tactics that were used against the Armenians and others during the Armenian Genocide. So we have to ask ourselves, how is it that we can, as a nation, as Americans, speak credibly against these present-day atrocities when we remain silent under the very public pressure of the Turkish government against Turkish genocide of millions of Armenians, Greeks, Assyrians, Chaldeans, Syriacs, Arameans, and others during the First World War? It's a huge disjoint. Now, U.S. recognition may not solve every problem, but it's an absolute essential place to start. We cannot be credible on present-day atrocities if we're so publicly silenced by a foreign dictator regarding past atrocities. Moving on. Our request of President Trump, knowing as we do that he ran on a platform of rejecting foreign influence over the U.S. government on economic issues, on foreign policy issues, on so many different issues. He made a major campaign plank out of rejecting foreign influence over Americans and in our government. We believe, and I think we join with people of good conscience of all backgrounds, we believe he should, in his April 24th statement, announce that the U.S. government will no longer enforce Turkey's gag rule against honest American remembrance of the Armenian Genocide. It'll be consistent with everything is said on the subject of foreign influence over American policy, and we believe he's morally obligated to do that as late as April 24th, or ideally even before that. It's never too early to get it right, and America needs to be on the right side of this issue. Let's all call upon the president to do the right thing. We have today in Congress, leadership in the House and Senate from both parties, leaders who have been supportive on the issue of the Armenian Genocide going back many, many years. In the Senate, we have Senator McConnell, who's been a friend of Armenia. We have Senator Schumer on the Democratic side, who has been at the Times Square observance of the Armenian Genocide for many, many years. In the House, we have Speaker Ryan and Majority Leader McCarthy on the Republican side. On the Democratic side, we have Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer, both of whom have been strong advocates on the Armenian Genocide issue. All of these folks need to now live up to the words that they've spoken for many years, and they should pass bipartisan legislation dealing with the Armenian Genocide. On the House side, we have H.Res.220. That's a genocide prevention measure written in a more broad context, dealing with how best to prevent genocide today, how best to avoid atrocities today, but it draws upon the lessons of the Armenian Genocide. What did America get right? What did America get wrong? Let us learn from that experience and apply those lessons to making the world safer today. I think it's as terrible as what happened to the Armenians was, and it certainly was among the worst horrors ever visited upon any people in the world. Let that terrible experience serve humanity by helping us understand how to get it right the next time. So that's H.Res.220. We have S.Res.136, which is in the U.S. Senate, which calls for the U.S. foreign policy to appropriately reflect the lessons and understanding and sensitivity to the crime of genocide committed against the Armenians. And it says basically that, we need to be on the right side of this issue, and that we need to be, in all that we do in foreign policy, weave in the lessons of this still unpunished crime. Moving on. We have, of course, as we do every April, an observance on Capitol Hill. We will have members of the Senate and House come together, some years on the House side, some years on the Senate side, but always on Capitol Hill, a remembrance of the Armenian Genocide, where members of Congress come and speak to us and join with us in honoring the victims of this crime, recommitting ourselves to a just resolution of this atrocity, and reaffirming our common commitment to a world without genocide, ending the cycle forever of genocide. There's other aspects of this that I think that we need to take a more careful look at in the coming year. There has been a great focus, primarily dealing with Russia, about foreign collusion in U.S. politics and U.S. policymaking, and that's obviously a good thing. We should never let any foreign entity influence or manipulate how we govern ourselves as a nation. There hasn't, though, been much of a focus on Turkey's efforts to interfere in U.S. Foreign policy, which I think they've done perhaps at a greater scale and for a longer period than any other nation in the world. There needs to be a focused effort by the House and Senate Intelligence Committees on exactly what Turkey has done, how they have done it, to try to shape, manipulate, interfere with U.S. policymaking. And even deeper than that, they need to look at have U.S. officials been complicit in that effort? Has there been U.S. collusion in Turkish efforts to, for example, deny the Armenian Genocide, or to bias the peace talks for Artsakh, or to prevent the return of Christian churches and other religious properties across Anatolia? These are serious issues that deserve a lot of attention. I think as Erdogan continues his anti-American trajectory, there may be great opportunities for traction for a much-needed, long overdue U.S. investigation into Turkish interference and U.S. complicity. So that's going to be a focus, and we would welcome your support for that through support at anca.org/2018. Moving on now, it was last May 16th, that the Recep Erdogan, the Turkish president's bodyguards, attacked peaceful protesters at the Turkish ambassador's residence right near the ANC office, just a few blocks from here. We're close to DuPont Circle. The attack took place at Sheridan Circle, which is in DC talk, one circle away from where we are located. I was there. I was able to film that, share our live footage with CNN, with the Associated Press, and all the major networks. Turned a local violent incident into a global spotlight on Ankara's aggression and Erdogan's arrogance. The fact of the matter, though, is that even after all this time, Turkey remains entirely unapologetic. They sent their foreign minister to Washington, D.C., and during that time, he actually visited the prison where the members, the two of the assailants, are being held, and sitting with them, he photographed himself with these two assailants, and said, "The Turkish nation stands with you." Well, think about that. Stands with you. These are two men convicted of, and now they're in the process of pleading guilty to, assaulting unarmed, defenseless, peaceful protesters in Washington, D.C. They were trying and essentially implementing a Turkish policy of silencing dissent. A policy that has been sadly very effective back home within Turkey. They've exported that now to the United States, and feel apparently that they have the license to attack Americans on American soil simply for speaking their minds. We were there speaking about human rights in Turkey. Erdogan's imprisonment of, for example, Pastor Andrew Brunson, and actually many thousands, even tens of thousands of citizens in Turkey for simply speaking their minds. Journalists and others. Turkey today jails more writers and journalists than any country in the world, more than China. So those two gentlemen are now in the process of pleading guilty, and hopefully will serve at the very least a year in prison. But the fact is that the vast majority of the guilty parties have fled the country. Some fled to Canada, where they have avoided American justice. The others, roughly 15 of President Erdogan's Turkish bodyguards, were spirited out of the country. 2 were held by the U.S. police for having on camera attacked Americans, and under pressure from the Turkish government, they were allowed to leave. All of them now are out of the country, beyond the reach of the American justice system. They need to be returned. That's this point here, which is that here we are. We're looking at it's January 10th, 2018, and the administration has yet to formally request the extradition of these those charged with these crimes. The Turkish bodyguards and security detail of President Erdogan are demonstrably guilty. They've been charged by a grand jury, indicted and charged for very serious crimes. There's no dispute that they're guilty, and yet the administration has yet to demand that they be extradited and that they stand trial here in the U.S. For the crimes that they are charged with. That should be a no-brainer. There is no question about the facts. Erdogan himself is boastful about the actions of his of his bodyguards. If he's so confident that they are in the right, then he would be glad, I imagine, to send them back here to stand trial, and we can, they can get the justice that they deserve. That's really very, very serious shortcoming of this administration, and we did not see the president speak out as he should at the time of the attack, and now all these months later, his Department of Justice, his Department of State, is yet to seek the extradition of these assailants, and that's something that we're going to address very seriously this year. Let's turn now our attention to Armenia. In addition to secure, free, safe, democratic Artsakh, in addition to a just resolution of the Armenian genocide, we are deeply devoted to strengthening Armenia, primarily through the growth of the U.S. Armenia Partnership. Now, right behind me here, over here, is a picture of July 4th, 1918. It's a group of Armenian Americans in San Francisco, and they've gathered to celebrate American independence. So now, 100 years later, after the First Republic, we are now marking a major milestone in the U.S.-Armenia relationship. And I think we've seen, obviously, building upon the relationship that existed during the First Republic, we have seen over the last quarter century the steady expansion of that partnership. We work closely together on bilateral issues, on multilateral issues, and on a broad array of international challenges. One of the key aspects or the key platforms for that cooperation is NATO. Armenia is a member of NATO's Partnership for Peace, which is a great platform for cooperation on a lot of different issues. And Armenia, I think, is number 5 in the world per capita in terms of contributions of its dedication of troops to international peacekeeping efforts. And Armenia has been very supportive of U.S.-led peacekeeping in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Kosovo, in Lebanon, and even Mali. Armenia has been really stepped up and been a great partner. We believe that this is part of a broader transition for Armenia. If during much of the first quarter century of these relations with the newly independent republic, or the newly reborn independent Republic of Armenia, if much of that relationship was based in the early part of that time, based on aid and assistance and helping Armenia stand itself up and get it moving on the right track, we've seen a transition away from assistance more to trade and investment, and also cooperation on security issues. Let me see here. We think that, as it says here, that mutually beneficial commercial ties can represent very powerful anchors for progress in U.S.-Armenia relations, and that cooperation on security issues as well, on anti-proliferation, on healthcare issues, on a whole range of international challenges, the U.S. and Armenia can be very, very close partners, and we look forward to supporting that. We also would like to see, this is a very concrete and very doable ask for the coming year. Right now, there is no valid, mutually agreed upon tax treaty between the U.S. and Armenia. The two countries have very different views of a 1973 treaty that was signed between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, I think between the administrations of Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev. They signed an accord clarifying tax obligations between the United States and a country that essentially no longer exists. Armenia does not consider itself heir to that treaty, so for Armenian purposes, it's no longer enforced. The U.S. considers it enforced. It's kind of an unworkable situation. It's also an agreement that was signed between two hostile powers, not nearly sufficient to meet the needs of the present U.S.-Armenia relationship, much less the growth that we would like to see in that relationship. Now, the Department of Treasury can negotiate that treaty with Armenia. Armenia has expressed its interest in having that treaty, and more so, they've even expressed interest in moving forward on the basis of the U.S. model treaty. And the willingness of Armenia to do that lifts much of the negotiating burden from the U.S. side and would streamline that process considerably. So we're very devoted in the next 12 months to seeing the administration and specifically the Treasury Department get moving on a tax treaty. Doing that, getting that treaty in place, that accord, making that accord functional, would remove a barrier to the growth of trade and send a very powerful signal to U.S. Business leaders that Armenia is open for business and ready to respect all the rules of the road and to protect their profits from unnecessary double taxation. We'd also like to see in this coming year movement on direct flights. That's primarily passenger flights, but also cargo flights. Very often those flights are combined in one flight. The direct commercial and cargo flights between Los Angeles and Yerevan. The administration and Congress can support that effort by putting in place the administrative and regulatory framework needed for that, for those flights to begin. Of course, the flights themselves need to be commercially viable. The carriers need to study the situation and understand that they can make a profit, running these flights. But our piece of the puzzle, among many, but an important piece of the puzzle, is making sure that the government, the U.S. government side, is ready and eager and prepared to do whatever's necessary to remove any barriers to those flights, which would connect two really important centers. I mean, the center of the Armenian homeland, Yerevan, and in many ways the center of gravity of the Armenian diaspora, Los Angeles. That connection would be good in terms of culture, in terms of commerce, in terms of cargo. On every level, it will be a good thing. So we'd like to see progress on that. This year, we're going to work very hard with the administration, Congress, obviously, stakeholders in Armenia and the United States on that priority. There are, even as we make this transition from aid to trade, there still are important components of the assistance relationship that need to continue. One is the aid program to Armenia. Now, over the past several years, we've seen well over $2 billion in U.S. assistance to Armenia. We believe that the right number for the coming year is $40 million. Obviously, the focus is no longer on humanitarian help. We'd like to see the focus on assistance that materially strengthens the economic relationship and that also helps Armenia's security partnership with the United States. So economic and military and security cooperation facilitated by $40 million in U.S. assistance. On the military side, we place a very high priority on the NATO interoperability, so Armenia integrating its systems with its partners in NATO, especially in the area of peacekeeping. Other aid priorities for Armenia include assistance to help Armenia settle refugees from the Middle East. Now, Armenia deserves a lot of credit for its highly commendable openness to accepting refugees from the Middle East, many of whom are Armenian, but some of whom are not. Armenia has done an awful lot to take in, I think, close down to 23,000 refugees. For a small country facing serious financial challenges, that is a heavy lift, and they deserve the support of the international community, the United Nations, but especially the United States. So we'd like to see the Congress and the President support a $40 million appropriation to help Armenia transition those who have made the move from the Middle East. Some of these are Armenians. Many of them survived the Armenian genocide of the First World War, only to face renewed aggression in the last decade in the Middle East, in Syria and Iraq. And some of these folks are trying to build a new home in their ancient homeland, and we think that they deserve support from the U.S. government. That's a very high priority for us. Parallel to that, we are encouraged by the willingness of the administration and an effort spearheaded by Vice President Pence to take a second look at how the U.S. government distributes assistance to at-risk minorities across the Middle East. In the past, there have been different views of the situation. The U.S. has focused primarily on the UN channel, the United Nations channel, to distribute aid. That hasn't always worked. And there's also been a focus on civic organizations and an effort to steer clear of faith-based groups in distributing aid. That's also created some very serious gaps. As a result of sort of this old thinking, many groups, through no ill intent, but many groups, including Christians and including Armenians, were left out of the stream of international aid. So while billions of dollars flowed into Syria, for example, very, very little of that ever reached Armenians. Vice President Pence has announced a new policy in which they will direct this assistance through USAID, not through the United Nations. So much of this aid now will be channeled directly from the U.S. government to those in need. And there will be a loosening of restrictions on working with churches and other faith-based groups to get that assistance in the hands of the families and people who need that assistance. So there's a change in policy. It's not across the board. It's not 100% change in policy, but a renewed focus on how the U.S. government can remove the barriers that prevented or that kept the Armenians and other religious minorities, Christians primarily, out of the aid stream. So we're focusing and working with the administration on that as well. So it's a dual effort, helping the Armenians and others who've settled in Armenia, helping them get a new start, and also making sure that this international assistance that does reach Syria and Iraq actually gets to the people who need the assistance. That's our focus on Syrian Armenians and Middle Eastern issues for the coming months. We, parallel to this effort, there's a USAID aid channel, which is very big part of U.S. international development assistance. But there's also something called the Millennium Challenge Account, which you may recall about a dozen years ago initiated a major aid program to Armenia to help with irrigation and roads, and it was implemented with great success, although it did suffer some setbacks based on some election issues in Armenia, which resulted in the U.S. government withholding a portion of the aid. We're beyond that now, and we believe that Armenia is very powerfully positioned to be eligible for renewed new Millennium Challenge Compact. We think that Armenia will be eligible for that. They need to meet all the tests for corruption and good governance. We think they're moving in the right direction. We're hopeful that all those tests will be met, and that the Millennium Challenge Corporation will consider in this coming cycle Armenia for a new contract. That contract, in our view, should not be about roads or irrigation or even infrastructure. It should be about education, educating the young people of Armenia, especially in the area of STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and math. A grant in excess of 140 or more $million could transform the Armenian educational landscape, really catapulting Armenia to the next level in terms of its IT future. So the Millennium Challenge account and a new STEM grant for education would be a very positive contribution to Armenia and the U.S.-Armenia partnership. It's a very, very high priority for our community and certainly for the ANCA. Armenia's got to just clear the hurdles and meet the tests in terms of corruption and governance. Once that's done, I think we can see some great progress on that front. There's also, if we aggregate, and this is again why we need your support, every spring, the Armenian Caucus, led by Frank Pallone, David Valadeo, Jackie Spear, Adam Schiff, Dave Trott, Congressman Bilirakis, and others. These members of the Armenian Caucus lead a congressional letter. This is on the House side. They lead a congressional letter which touches on each of the aid issues that I've reviewed and asks the members of the House Foreign Aid Committee, essentially it's the Appropriations Subcommittee on State Foreign Operations. It encourages the leadership of that committee, Chairman Rogers and Ranking Member Lowy, it encourages them to support all these issues. By writing to your member of Congress at anca.org/2018, you'll be asking your members of Congress to sign that letter. That letter, in turn, will encourage the leaders of the committee who write the foreign aid bill to include our priorities in the legislation that they ultimately adopt. So these things do matter, so please do. I'm going to remind you again, visit anca.org/2018. Getting a strong Armenian Caucus letter to the appropriators is very, very important. Moving on. We have some regional concerns that are very high on our list. We need to look very seriously at the transfer and sale of U.S. weapons to Armenia's part of the world. We have to think very carefully about whether these weapons will ultimately be used either for offensive purposes or even possibly against the United States and our allies. The two countries, obviously of particular concern to us, are Turkey and Azerbaijan. We were gratified earlier this year, actually late in 2017, last year, to see the Congress stop a small but important U.S. arms sale to Turkey. The U.S. was set to sell, if you can believe this, U.S. small arms, American firearms, to President Erdogan's security detail, the very same detail that attacked U.S. protesters on May 16th. As you might expect, that sale was blocked by Congress and ultimately withdrawn by the administration. That's good, but it's not enough. There are other sales that are in the queue that are on the table, including a very major sale of Lockheed Martin F-35 jets to Turkey. That has not moved forward formally yet, but we're paying very close attention to this issue. We think it would serve nobody's interest, certainly not American interests or the interests of peace in the region, to see the Turkish military's abilities and offensive capacities so dramatically expanded through the introduction of F-35s. They have proven themselves a vastly unreliable ally, and we worry that they would use those either for offensive purposes, possibly against Armenia, possibly against Greece, and that's a very, very serious concern of ours. It's parallel to our concern about the positioning of U.S. nuclear weapons at the Incirlik Air Base. NATO nuclear weapons, we understand about 50 of them. Hydrogen bombs are stationed in southeastern Turkey. We worry that the U.S. government may one day, under assault by the Erdogan regime, lose control of those weapons. That would be both highly destabilizing, placing weapons of vast power and destructive ability in the hands of Recep Erdogan. That serves no one's interest. It's our thought that the U.S. and NATO should work immediately to reposition those nuclear weapons. If they served a purpose 30, 40, 50 years ago, the only influence, the only interest, the only impact they have today is to destabilize the region. And moving on, we have Azerbaijan. And again, just as we are nervous about U.S. arms or technology or parts ending up in the hands of the Turkish military, so too are we concerned about that happening in the case of Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan has committed cross-border acts of aggression in the last several years against both Armenia and Artsakh. We have heard reports that the drones deployed by Azerbaijan possibly have U.S. parts technology. So that would be that would then be subject to U.S. law, which requires U.S. approval for the third-party transfer of U.S. parts, technology, or weapons to other nations. We are following that very closely, investigating that, working with partners here in Washington, and also encouraging the U.S. government to investigate these matters. There's one particular sale that is of great concern to us, and that is discussion of Israel selling the Iron Dome system. This is an anti-missile system to Azerbaijan. The Iron Dome system was jointly developed with the U.S. government, which means that it includes U.S. parts and technology. Part of the agreement that the U.S. and Israel signed to manufacture those missiles, part of that agreement was that Israel would need to get written U.S. permission before there was any third-party transfer of those weapons. There was discussion in late 2016 when Netanyahu met with Aliyev about Israel selling these systems. Subsequent to that, there's been a lot of focus, I think much of it driven by us, about whether or not the U.S. should grant that third-party license. To this day, there has been no approval for any transfer of that sort, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be immensely vigilant. An anti-missile system in the hands of Azerbaijan would, in our view, represent a first strike weapon. Azerbaijan would be emboldened to initiate a unprovoked aggression against the Armenian side, confident that they could blunt the impact of any counterattack using this Iron Dome system. Essentially, in Aliyev's hands, Iron Dome would be an offensive weapon, and we are very vigilant in making sure that system does not end up in Aliyev's arsenal. So that, I think, brings us to the end of this review of some of our 2018 policy priorities. I will ask you, please, if you've stayed with this message for this long, I know you're deeply devoted to all the issues that we discussed today. So I ask you again, please visit ANCA.org. Visit ANCA.org. Send a letter to your members of Congress. The letter is pre-written, but you can customize it. The letter will go to your 2 U.S. senators and your 1 U.S. representative, and that letter will cover each of the policy priorities that have been addressed here, a little more briefly than the treatment they got in this video, but nonetheless, I think it's about 2 or 3 pages of text setting forth each of your priorities and asking them, first, what is your position on each of these issues? And second, what actions have you taken in support of these priorities. So with that said, I'm going to sign off and thank you for your time. Thank you for your support, and thank you for your ideas. You can always send your thoughts to the ANCA. You can write to ideas@anca.org and send your suggestions. We benefit greatly from the many, many ideas and suggestions we get from our community. And you can always write to me directly at Aram, ARAM, @anca.org, Aram@anca.org. I look forward to your messages, your emails, your compliments, your criticisms. It's your feedback that keeps us strong. And with that, I will sign off and say thank you very much.